Good morning, everybody. This is Aaron. Thank you for joining me for Sunday Morning Live. In this episode, I think I'm gonna share some pretty cool information. I've talked about the left-hand path on here before. Most people aren't even familiar with the terms left-hand path or right-hand path or how it applies to spirituality or just their life in general. You don't have to be spiritual to get something out of this. In fact, I think those of you that are atheists or scientific materialists, if you'll hang around and listen to what I have to say, I think you'll find something beneficial and helpful in there for you as well. Give me a second to change my settings here and give people a chance to jump on. Make sure I save it as public on Facebook. And then I can share it to some groups. And I just want to make sure it made it there. Hope you're doing well. I think it's, what is it, the 29th of December. So if you're not watching this live, if you're catching a replay, Alan says, hey, bro. Hey, nice to see you, Alan. I can see a few comments today. Benny says, good morning. Good morning, Benny. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope you had a good Christmas, December 29th, in between Christmas and New Year's. So, yeah, just making sure and giving people a little bit more time to jump on. Joyce says, watching on the Facebook site today. Hi, Joyce. Thanks for joining. Thanks for commenting, everybody. And if I don't see your comment, if I don't respond, it's either my ADHD or I'm just not able to see all the comments because I don't know if it's the platform I'm using. More than likely, it's an Aaron issue. And I'm just not using it correctly or know what I'm looking at. Or I just miss it because I have some ADHD. So let's jump into this. I'm going to talk about, I've talked about this before on my channel. This is going to be not a rehash of the same old information, at least not in the same way. Dawn's watching from Scotland. Hi, Dawn. I wonder what time is it in Scotland? You guys are like, what, 7 hours ahead of us, I think. Anyway. Right hand, left hand path spirituality. This is not something that's part of common vernacular, even within spiritual circles, unless you specifically are on the left hand path. You probably don't know the terms or who cares about it anyway, that kind of stuff. But I think it's really, really important. I think it's an understanding. I think it's information that can really help us to identify where we want to go on this journey of either philosophy or spirituality. And everybody has a philosophy of life, I would like to argue that everybody has a spiritual path as well. But for people who are simply interested in this material existence and their natural lives, the word for spirit or spirituality becomes problematic. So we could just substitute the term philosophy, and everybody has a philosophy of life. And so when you're looking at the left-hand path, the right-hand path, yes, they are spiritual paths, but they're also philosophical paths that lead to very different existential outcomes. In other words, they have a very significant bearing upon our lives. And it gives us a frame, it gives us a framework, a mental framework, whereby we can evaluate all the teaching that we're listening to. There's so many, I've almost wanted to stop doing YouTube. I've quit making videos for YouTube except on Sunday mornings, partly because there's such a plethora of channels and information and millions and millions of people talking about the same stuff and the same things. And there's people that do a much better job than I can do, than I'm even capable of doing, with creating content, videos, and stuff like that. So it can be a little bit overwhelming. But just searching out and trying to find information. So I want you to think with me for a minute as we're going through this. Why are you watching this today? Or why do you watch any teaching, regardless of the platform, whether you're reading a book, you're listening to a podcast, watching something on YouTube, following somebody on Facebook who's sharing posts and sharing posts and information. Why are you doing that? What's your intention when you do that? Now, whether we're fully aware of it or we can fully give language to it or not, most of us are doing that because we're looking for something that's going to help us on our journey, or for the sake of this teaching and this video, to help us along our path. But if we're taking a path, if we're taking a journey, we need to know the destination. We need to know where it is that we want to end up. And if we know where it is that we want to end up, and then we can really evaluate whether or not we want to spend our time, which is our most precious commodity. And I deeply appreciate everyone who spends their time with me, whether you're watching live or you're watching by replay, whether you're watching portions of it or you're watching the whole thing. I deeply appreciate that you're spending this time with me, because I understand that time is one of the most precious resources that we have. So just think for yourself for a minute, to yourself for a minute. Think to yourself for a minute. What is your reason for watching this? What is your reason for watching any video, reading any book, whether it's self-help, whether it's philosophical, whether it's informational, whether it's spiritual? And how does that connect to your overall purpose? Or do you even have any kind of destination in mind? Because when we're talking about the right-hand path and the left-hand path, we're talking about two very distinct paths, and we're talking about ending up in two very distinct states of being, or you could say, since I've been talking about consciousness a lot on my channel, very distinct states of consciousness. So Don says it's 4:55 there, and it is now, you must have posted that comment earlier, it's about 10:15 in the morning here in Colorado in the United States, where I'm coming to you live from on Facebook or on YouTube. But I want you to think about that. Maybe you haven't given a lot of thought to this. And so maybe for the new year, a good thing for you to do is to think about to be more proactive about your spiritual life, self-help life, or if nothing else, the information that you consume. Be more mindful about it, be more aware, be more proactive, and be more intentional about it. If you don't know immediately the answers to those questions, why are you watching? How do you decide what kind of content? And where is it that you want to end up in terms of your state of consciousness and your existential self? Joyce says, I find people that I resonate with and validate what I already know in my soul. Okay, so that's a good segue, actually, because the right-hand path, left-hand path has everything to do with the concept of the soul. So I'm going to introduce some terms. Some of this might sound pretty technical, but I'm going to try to be as clear in my communication as possible, so that to the best of my ability, I can communicate the ideas that I want to communicate. So I'm going to talk about the ancient origins of some certain things and how they are still influencing us today. Today, we have this idea, and I've used this term a lot, that there's this divide between the East and the West. There is Western philosophy and there is Eastern philosophy. There's Western spiritual practices, which typically is referred to as the Western wisdom tradition or the Western esoteric tradition. We typically think of the Abrahamic religions as being Western. And then there is what we call Eastern philosophy, which has to do with the Vedas. It has to do with Hinduism, Buddhism, generally has to do with polytheism. Western tradition, as we call it, is primarily monotheistic, the belief in just one God that's out there. Everything else is false or idols or demons. Unless, of course, you're practicing something like Wicca or neo-paganism, which incorporates the old, oftentimes European gods. It doesn't have to be European, but oftentimes it's things like Odin and Freya and the Celtic gods and goddesses, like the Morrigan is the only one I can think of off the top of my head for some reason. Sometimes maybe borrowing names from the Greco-Roman world, like Zeus or Aphrodite, stuff like that, incorporating a polytheistic ideology or philosophy into your spiritual practice. But for the most part, predominantly within the Western tradition, both the Western esoteric wisdom traditions and the Abrahamic Judeo-Christian ideas is primarily monotheistic. And then we think about Eastern religions as definitely being more polytheistic or not theistic, more anti-theist forms of Buddhism is what I'm thinking about. Although there are theistic forms of Buddhism as well, we have a tendency to homogenize these things because we don't understand them. And it's not our fault that we don't understand them. Part of the reason that I don't mess a lot with Eastern philosophies is because I realized that it would take years of studying Eastern philosophies to really even just begin to understand it. And I don't want to spend all that time. But what I don't want to do is not be aware of what I don't know that I don't know. I'm going to say that again. I want to be aware of the fact that if I venture into that arena, there's going to be a lot of stuff that I don't know. And so the first probably couple years of a practice that we call Eastern, whether it's Zen Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism, I mean, sure, we can practice certain aspects of meditation. We can incorporate certain fundamental principles like compassion and empathy and things like that and say, oh, that comes from the East. But the truth of the matter is that this delineation between East and West that we think about today, particularly Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy, is a byproduct of the economic system that we live in and have lived in for centuries. This delineation between East and West is primarily economic and not philosophical. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because I want to go into this idea between a left-hand path and a right-hand path is almost like lost ancient wisdom because it way predates. It's one of the idea of the right-hand path, the left-hand path. Oops, I did that wrong. Left-hand path, right-hand path comes from the most ancient sacred manuscripts that we have. Maybe aside from the Sumerian tablets, I'm not sure about the dating there. The Sumerian tablets might be older than the Vedas, but I honestly think the Vedas are the oldest texts that we have that way predate Abrahamic religions in general. I know we say that, Abraham and Moses and all those guys were, living, what is it, like 4,000 years ago, Adam 6,000 years ago. But the fact of the matter is that the first mention of Moses doesn't show up anywhere in any writings, which we have writings, Jewish writings, that predate this time period. In fact, a whole library of works was discovered that belonged to an ancient Jewish community, and there is no mention of Abraham. There is no mention of Moses. This is something that shows up, I want to say, around 300-400 BC, after the Babylonian captivity. So we know for sure with modern dating that the Vedas predate that by a lot, and they talk about two primary paths. So we tend to think of the Vedas as being something that is Eastern in its origin or Eastern in its philosophical persuasion. But the fact of the matter is that it's more Indo-European. So Indo-European refers to languages, ancient languages, and certain languages, I think still today, but for our purposes today, these ancient languages that were spoken in India, parts of Asia, parts of Europe. So it's Indo-European is what it's called. And spiritual philosophies tended to come from the North and the South rather than from the East and the West. So when we're talking about differences in spiritual philosophies, it is more accurate to identify what's Northern and what's Southern. But that's really getting into the weeds with stuff. And I said I wasn't going to do that today. Be a little more technical, but I want to make it a little more practical. So I'm going to move on from that. My point is that from the very origins, the very beginnings of religion, of spirituality, there was a recognition. I'm not just talking about a passing reference to something. I'm saying there were two spiritual systems that were recognized and practiced within Indo-European cultures. One system would be identified as the right-hand path, and the other system would be identified as the left-hand path. And in their ancient origins, they were given, I would say, probably from everything I can understand from scholars, equal validation on which path that you're on. So, Aaron, what is the difference? What are you even talking about? What is the left-hand path? What is the right-hand path? What is the difference? So, in order to understand that, I want to talk about one of the more ancient concepts, and we still find this in the Western esoteric tradition. And when I'm talking about the Western esoteric tradition, I'm talking specifically about Hermeticism. I'm talking about the philosophies of Kemet or Egypt, the spiritual systems and philosophies and ideas that come from there, the ideas and philosophies that come from Zoroastrianism, and then certainly found their ways into the Abrahamic religion. But you'll still find this today in Hermeticism specifically. You'll find this today in Jewish Kabbalah or Hermetic Kabbalah. One of the primary foundational ideas is that there are two universes that we all live in. Now, I'm not talking about multiverse theory. The word that's used would be cosmos or cosm. And so they would talk about the objective universe, that being what we can think of as the world outside of us, everything that exists independently of us and that exists outside of us. So that would be called, the objective universe would be called the macrocosm in the languages of these spiritual systems. And then we have a subjective universe, which is our consciousness. Everything about our consciousness, everything about our awareness, our individual inside. So we delineate today as inside outside. So whatever's inside of us would be the subjective universe, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, our desires, our passions. All of that would be part of the subjective universe or the microcosmos or the microcosm. And everything outside of us, the sun, the moon, the trees, you, me, would be considered part of the macrocosm, part of the objective cosmos, or part of the bigger, larger picture and larger universe. You have to understand these concepts to understand the paths, because they have to do with the macrocosm and the microcosm, or the objective universe and the subjective universe. In the Talmud, it would say that to save a person, that if you saved a person, if you saved their life, not talking Christian salvation here, this is the Talmud, but if you save a person, that you actually saved a universe. Or you saved a whole universe, you saved a whole cosmos. And I love that idea because it really amplifies for us the fact that our inner world, our subjective universe, what I've been calling our consciousness, is a massive, expansive place that has both known territory and unknown territory. So I love that. So in the Talmud, there was a passage that would say, if you saved a person's life, it was like saving an entire universe. Okay, Aaron, what does this have to do with anything? I want you to think about, in terms of the objective universe, the world outside of us, and the subjective universe, the world of our internal soul, mind, spirit, consciousness. I want you to think of them as separate but interacting things, because we are here in the macrocosmos. We are here in the objective universe, but we are bringing with us our subjective universe, our own ideas, our own opinions, all of this stuff. And then we are interacting and relating with the objective universe. So they are interpenetrating each other. What do you mean interpenetrating each other? Well, you can think of intercourse, right? there is intercourse between the subjective universe and the objective universe. In other words, so when we talk about something being objective, if I'm being objective here, it means I'm trying to take my subjectivity out of it and set aside the subjective universe in order to talk objectively about something. The whole purpose of the scientific method is to be objective, but again, it can't totally be subjective because it's all based on observation, and the observer is bringing the subjective universe. And of course, quantum physics, which is way past my pay grade of understanding of stuff, that's another field that I would have to get into for years to try to understand, to make sure I really knew what I was talking about, because I want to be aware that I don't know what I don't know about a topic. And so unless I've really spent a lot of time with it, I could be saying something that I am mistaken about and think that I'm right. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Happens all the time. I try to avoid that as much as possible. If you're interested, you can Google the Dunning-Kruger effect if you've never heard of that either. All right, so this is the way it works. We tend to take elements of our subjective universe and force it onto the objective universe. This is a case of what we call classic projection. So this is where we have ideas, thoughts, beliefs about what we think is happening, what we think is going on, what we think is the nature of something outside of us. And we incorporate that as part of our subjective universe into how we relate to those things or those people. But it may or may not be accurate. It may or may not actually have existence in the objective universe. It may only have its existence in my subjective universe, but I'm imposing my subjective universe on the objective. This is where atheists that are passionate, and they're right, because we are taking something out of our own subjective experience. We are taking something out of our own subjective universe, the ideas we have about God, the ideas we have about salvation, and all this stuff that religion does, and we're imposing it on everybody else around us without the empirical objective evidence that this actually exists in the objective world. So atheism begins with the recognition that there is this interplay between the subjective and the objective, between the subjective universe, the world inside of us, and the objective universe, and that we oftentimes as human beings try to superimpose our subjective universe onto the objective and then relate to it as though it is objectively real. Now, again, keep in mind, it may or may not be objectively real. The point is that we cannot come up with objective proof or evidence or information that can then eliminate the possibility that we are projecting our ideas onto the objective universe. This is also how societies are formed. Societies are 100% formed by thought leaders, idea leaders, people that have power, people that have money, that impose, or a collective group that impose the ideas that they have onto the world. This is where all morality comes from. This is where all ethics come from. So that's the way that we can impress the subjective. That's the way that the subjective world gets impressed upon the objective world. In other words, we don't accept the objective world and just go with the flow as it is. This is really important to get this foundation and understanding before I start talking about the left-hand and right-hand path. We don't accept the world as it is. We don't accept objectively out there what is as it is. We subjectively, so if you've been following my channel, if you've been listening to my last couple of months of talks, you'll see that I've been talking a lot about this shamanic idea that we are all dreaming our reality, that we are taking a subjective template, a template from the subjective universe, and we are superimposing it and placing it upon the objective world around us, and then wanting everybody else or someone else wanting us to conform to whatever that may be. So we are born into the corporate dream. This is the dream of society. This is where the subjective universe interacts with the objective universe, trying to impose itself upon the objective world, upon the objective cosmos. This is how ancient cosmologies came into existence. We know they didn't come into existence, these ancient cosmologies of gods and what the stars were, and the earth being the center of the universe. We know that none of this came from how things actually are. So these were ideas. These were all elements of the psyche. These were all elements of the soul, elements of the mind, if you prefer, that what I'm calling the subjective universe imposed as realities upon the objective world. Now, by the same token, because that is going on, then the objective world will also try to impose upon the subjective. These two are really, there's a lot of conflict here that's so basic to life. We can take it from a natural standpoint. Again, some of my friends that are atheists say the universe is conspiring to kill you. When they're talking about the universe, they're talking about the macrocosm. And they're saying the macrocosm is conspiring to eliminate the microcosm. Because even from a materialist standpoint, if you believe that consciousness, awareness, the subjective universe is the byproduct of the brain, it's the byproduct of matter and materialism, there's a recognition that even though we're a product of nature, nature's trying to destroy us. Right? There's a conspiracy from the universe to try to kill us. And by that, what they mean is like a human being can't survive in outer space. And forget outer space, there's things in nature, tsunamis, hurricanes, tornadoes, things that are trying to destroy us, things that are trying to end our lives. So there's this tension, if you will, there's this battle where the objective universe is trying to get rid of the subjective that we can understand on the most basic parts of life. But now when we get into other things like philosophy, and we get into religion, and we get into morality, and we get into all these various different things, we can see other aspects where the objective universe is trying to impose on our subjective universe. So it's really important to understand the difference, the fundamental difference when I'm talking between the microcosm and the macrocosm, between the subjective universe and the objective universe, between the world inside of us, our thoughts, feelings, emotions, subjective universe, and the world outside of us. Why do you keep repeating yourself, Aaron? Because I think I might be introducing some new concepts and new vocabulary, and I want repetition is the key to learning, right? So I want to make sure that we can get this, because I'm laying, again, the foundation for what I'm going to talk about before I get into the Luciferian archetype. All right. So this is where this interaction or interplay between the objective universe and the subjective universe is where in the Vedas, I think it's the Vedas, I might have to double check myself on that, but you can Google it and find out for yourself, fact check me. This idea, so from a right-hand path perspective, the goal of the path begins with this recognition that there is a battle or a war between the subjective universe and the objective universe, that the two are not necessarily harmonious. And so the right-hand path says one of you has to change. And obviously, the more obvious thing would be that your subjective universe needs to conform and harmonize and align and come into agreement with the macro universe so that you can have right relationship with it. Okay? So it's about the making changes in the subjective universe in order to harmonize and align with the objective universe, which can be nature and natural law and science, or it can include, this is where religion comes in, the belief in a creator or the idea that nature comes from God. So ultimately, then, there's this idea that the subjective universe is in disharmony with God. And so, therefore, the subjective universe has to change. God and I are incompatible. One of us has to change. Therefore, God is God. I'm just a human being. I'm just a worm. So therefore, I need to change myself. And we choose a religious path. We can even choose a mystical path, because from this perspective, then, mysticism is all about harmonizing. Everything, every philosophy, every spiritual path, for the most part, that talks about oneness, that talks about ego, that talks about separation, is aligning with these concepts and these ideas that the subjective universe has to change and align. The idea in, again, what we call Eastern or Hinduism or Buddhism or some of these other philosophies, the idea of losing the self is all a right-hand path. In the idea of union with God in mysticism is a right-hand path. In other words, once you completely harmonize the subjective universe with the objective universe, you become one with it. The moment you become one with it, you dissolve the barrier or the boundary. What creates the boundary? Let me say it this way. What creates the boundary between the objective universe and the subjective universe so that we know one from the other is the contention and battle between the world out there and the world in here. That's one of the ways, or the primary way, according to this ancient thought and ancient philosophy, that we would know the difference. So when I become completely harmonized, when I become one with nature, or I become one with God, or I become one with all that is, or I experience oneness with all that is, all sense of separation disappears from me, then I essentially blend into the whole, merge in with the macrocosm, become part of the macrocosm, and lose all sense of separation. So anytime you're hearing people talk about these ideas of separation, talk about these ideas of ego, talk about these ideas of oneness, or losing sense of separation, then those more than likely are reflecting primarily a philosophy driven by the right-hand path. Because again, the key to the right-hand path is the subjective universe has to change for the objective, either the objective being nature or the objective being God. And so in the case of Christianity, the recognition of this battle between the subjective and the objective, because let's be honest, we're the only species on the planet that superimposes itself upon nature. Here's what I mean by that. If you were to examine the social order of wolves, you would find that wolf packs operate according to the same social order, whether they live in Colorado, or whether they live in Canada, or whether they live in Europe. And if you were to go back 100 years, it'd still be the same. 1,000 years, it'd still be the same. Presumably 1,000,000 years, primarily the social order of wolves is still going to be the same. Same thing with bees. Think about the tremendous social order that exists within a beehive. And those bees have had the same, or bees, not those bees, bees have had the same social order regardless of where they live on the planet, regardless of the time period that we examine them, they all interact and relate harmoniously and exactly in the same way, generation after generation after generation after generation. Human beings are completely different. Human beings, we have different social orders. There's a different social order to some degree between those of us that live closer to the West Coast than those that live on the East Coast. We just came out of the crazy political season, and you can see that there is a drastic difference of ideas and ideologies and visions for the country between those that are elephants and those that are donkeys, right? Those that are conservatives and those that are considered liberals or more progressives all have different ideas. So it's very evident that we do not harmonize with nature in the same way that other conscious entities harmonize with nature, which is what makes us, from a spiritual perspective, philosophical perspective, and certainly from a Judeo-Christian perspective, in the image of God. It's what separates us. It's the ancient myth of Prometheus, who steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity. That's not just talking about some idea about how ancient people discovered fire. It's talking about a very spiritual concept that the life of the gods, that which made them godlike, was given to humanity, and that spark of the divine is consciousness, or it is this incredible microcosm, this incredible subjective universe that we have, that we exist within, and that we use to interact, or that we come from, really, not just use, but who we are and where we come from to interact with the macrocosm or the universe at large around us. And so Christianity recognizes this conflict and says it's a conflict between God and us. And so therefore the goal is obedience. The goal is obedience. Whether it's an obedience of faith, there is a belief. All right, so let's do it this way. Christianity, from the perspective of the macrocosmos and the microcosmos, from the perspective of the objective universe, I'm just going to use that from now on, and the subjective universe, is a right-hand path to spirituality. Because from that perspective, in the objective universe is the creator God. In the objective universe, this God has a certain morality that is good, certain characteristics that are good and holy and pure and just and righteous. And we are free, we have free will. That's recognition of the subjective universe and the difference there, right? So we are created with free will, but our free will gets us into trouble. Our free will causes us to lose the good. Therefore, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And this sin, this exercise of free will shows up really, really young. It shows up at 2 years old when your child's telling you no, right? Telling the parent no. Why do 2-year-olds say no all the time? Because they're recognizing and developing their own subjective universe as separate from the objective universe. And that's what sin is. So then objectively, God gives his son, Jesus, to die on the cross for our sins. Those of you that are watching this that are fundamentalist Christians or evangelicals, you can be glad that the gospel is still being preached by Aaron. All right. So Jesus dies for our sins, and then we have to conform our subjective universe to the objective universe by accepting Christ as our Savior. So it's changing and then being conformed to the image of Christ, meaning my subjective universe is coming into submission to the objective God, the objective lordship of Jesus. And the more I can harmonize with that reality, that's the pathway to salvation. Then I can discover union with God, or I can live in heaven where we've all chosen to live harmoniously together, where basically, I guess, heaven would have to be, if you think about it, heaven would have to be the superimposition of the will of God upon every citizen of heaven without any challenge to it, which is why Christians say that we have to live this human experience anyway, that once we pass that test, that we will conform to the will of God. We have adjusted and changed the subjective universe until it aligns with the objective. And so this is the problem with religion. We take parts of ourselves and we adapt them, we change them, we lose them, we forsake them, we even try to kill them so that we can conform to the objective universe and God and find our way into heaven. All right, the left-hand path is distinct from the right-hand path in that it begins from the same place. It begins from the recognition that we have a subjective universe, and that subjective universe, at times at least, is in complete contradiction or at odds with the objective universe. So it's recognizing the reality of the soul, and in the same degree, recognizing the image of God or the image of the gods inside the subjective universe. In other words, free will. The left-hand path, rather than seeking to conform as much as possible to God, nature, laws, society, the dream of the world, rather than seeking to make all these adjustments to the subjective universe in order to blend with it, in order to experience oneness with it, people who choose the left-hand path look at that demarcation and differentiation between the subjective and the objective and say, I want to build the subjective. I want to express the subjective. I want to strengthen the subjective. I want to be more aware and more developed as a subjective universe. And then from that place, decide how I'm going to interact with the objective. And to a certain degree, well, to a pretty large degree, this sounds pretty radical, to a pretty large degree, how we can make adjustments in the macrocosm, in the objective universe, in order to harmonize the outside world with what I want on the inside world. So then from that perspective, all self-help, all self-improvement, all psychotherapy, all what am I trying to say here? Yeah, I think you get the point. Is at least in some shape or form starting from a left-hand path goal. So all New Year's resolutions are starting from a left-hand path goal. In other words, there's something that I desire, something in my internal universe, something that I want, and I want to produce it. Law of attraction, that's what I was trying to think of. I want to produce or attract that into my life. So all magic, all prayer, all self-help. Now you may say, Aaron, self-help is about making changes in the subjective universe. All of this is about making changes in the subjective universe, but it has two different goals. One goal is to strengthen and really kind of impose the will of the subjective upon the objective, meaning I want to make more money in 2025. Therefore, I'm going to enroll in a financial literacy course. I'm going to gain knowledge. Here's the key. I'm going to gain knowledge. I'm going to go back to school and get a degree. I'm going to go and learn a trade. I'm going to learn how to make my money make money for me how to make my money work for me instead of me working for my money. I'm going to learn about investments because I have this desire to increase financially, and I'm going to take this desire and I'm going to work with it in a way that imposes that upon the world, the objective, the macrocosm. Now, remember, we're doing this all the time anyway. We are constantly projecting. That's just what we do as human beings. That's what sets us apart from the bees and the wolves and that kind of stuff. So the left-hand path just acknowledges this. Instead of fighting against it, instead of trying to harmonize or align with something outside of the self, it begins with the self and says, okay, I'm going to end up projecting self anyway onto the macrocosm. I'm going to do it with intention. I'm going to do it with purpose. And as I do that, right, then I begin to exercise, at least on some level, the principles of the left-hand path. I hope that makes some sense to you. So right-hand path spirituality, to break it down and make it easy. Right-hand path spirituality says, I need to lose my one individuality, I need to lose the sense of separation, and I need to blend or meld into harmony with nature or with God and spirit. I'm going to subject the self to those things. I'm going to make changes within the self for that. The left-hand path, on the other hand, says, I want to further distinguish myself. I want to further differentiate this subjective universe. I want to sort of consolidate it. In other words, we all have to live within the macrocosm. It's a choice of, I'm going to live within the macrocosm, the objective universe, by changing everything in my subjective universe so I can have as much harmony as possible with what's outside of me, or I'm going to push for my independence and my freedom, really. So the left-hand path is really about individual freedoms. It's really about the fight for individual freedoms. It's about the fight for personal expression. It is a path that looks at the hive mind, if you will, areas of society or areas of life that have been imposed from the objective universe, the world outside of me, people outside of me, onto myself, that is in contradiction with the self. And rather than changing the self, I'm going to embrace the self. I'm going to expand the self. I'm going to affirm the self. I'm going to grow the self because I'm choosing my freedom rather than choosing conformity. So any path, spiritually, philosophically, that is developing that differentiation, that is honoring that differentiation, that is honoring of personal freedom, that is honoring of personal development, self-actualization, the actual growth and expression of the soul, would be considered, according to this ancient perspective, a left-hand path. Now, why did they call them right-hand path and left-hand path? This is important because I want to get into a thing called subliminal messaging for a minute, because subliminal messaging is directly related to this intercourse between the objective universe and the subjective universe, between the world outside of us and our consciousness. What is subliminal messaging? Subliminal means to go below, something that goes below sensory awareness, not necessarily sensory experience, but sensory awareness. I knew this question was going to come up. Somebody says, is it possible to be both? No. And I'll explain why in a minute. If we try to blend the two, I still haven't communicated well enough the difference between the left-hand path and the right-hand path. So let me just back up, because I get this question a lot. I knew this question was going to come up. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. All right, let's do it this way. Even though I'm saying you can't be on both paths together, it's sort of an either or thing. That is true. That is an either or category. You are either on the right or you're on the left. But we all have to live in this objective universe, this objective world. Even if we believe in an afterlife, most people that believe in an afterlife believe somebody's there, right? So there is always a recognition of relationship, always. So from that perspective, everything is one, because everything is interconnected and everything is related. You cannot escape that. So to be on the right-hand path is to say my objective is to completely conform to the objective. To be on the left-hand path is not to say, to hell with the objective. Screw that. I'm going to be as oppositional to it as possible and call that a spiritual path. And there are some people that have done that. A lot of people that have done that. Rather, it's to say, I am going to choose with consciousness and intention how to relate as a fully actualized human being, or a fully actualized consciousness, or a fully actualized conscious entity, or literally, quite literally, as my own God, my own divinity, in the way that I relate and interact. So I only make changes that are good for me. I only conform in areas where my conforming is palatable, acceptable, working for me. So even if I choose to agree with something that's out here, when I'm doing it from a place of conscious intention, and I'm doing it from the perspective of trying to grow and preserve this left hand, this consciousness, that's still left-hand path. Now, you can have a mixture of two within philosophies. You can have a mixture of two within philosophies. In other words, from the left-hand path, let me say it this way. From a left-hand path perspective, a path of personal self-development, I can make the choice to conform to right-hand path ideas, ways, ethics, etc. But if I'm on the right-hand path, I am trying to change in order to find harmony with everything that's around me. And my goal is to get to oneness. My goal is to lose all sense of separation. That's the primary difference. That's why you can't be on both. The goal of the right-hand path, remember, this is coming from ancient philosophies. Really, the idea of salvation from a Western evangelical perspective is unbiblical. The idea of heaven from a Western evangelical perspective is completely unbiblical and completely foreign to ancient Orthodox Christianity. Orthodox means right way. Notice, this is where the subliminal messaging comes in, because it's the right-hand path. You have to conform to our creeds. You have to conform to our church. And when you get to heaven, you have to conform to God's will. Where the left-hand path is snuck in is because, yes, Renegade, you absolutely major on the left-hand path. You are a warrior of the left-hand path from my perspective. And I love it because it's the one that I choose. Now, at least from an American perspective, and I realize I'm talking to people that aren't Americans, but I think this is true in a lot of European countries as well. But, you know, as Americans, we think we're the only free country in the world. Almost all the principles of American patriotism, freedom, free country, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, especially that pursuit of happiness part, that is all left-hand path stuff. And so in original Christianity, in the original scriptures, we merge with God. We become one with God until he is all in all. Just read 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We become all in all. The evangelical idea of salvation really gets a lot of these left-hand path ideas in them in that I want my soul to be saved. So the goal is that my subjective universe be saved, that I still maintain my independence. But it's not real independence if it has to be conformity to the will of God. So the goal, it's a question of what's your goal. Is your goal to more fully experience and express and live from the self, and then learn how to relate to the world outside of us from a more whole and self-actualized expression and perspective, your own divinity, as it were? Or am I submitting and subjecting to a higher authority that determines who I am, rather than any of that coming from within the self? So the left-hand path would say, I'm looking within the self and seeing how I can best express it in right relationship with the world around me. The right-hand path is saying, I have to lose myself. I have to crucify myself. It's not I that live, but Christ who lives in me. I have been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God. That's the goal of the right-hand path. Walk after the Spirit and mortify the deeds of the flesh. That is a right-hand path. Lose the ego so that you lose all sense of separation and you can come into oneness. That's a right-hand path. Almost all religions in the world are based on primarily right-hand path principles. The reason, again, I just want to say this again because I get this question a lot. The reason you can't be on both is because you cannot both be fully whole and self-actualized and fully conformed and aligned with nature and society at the same time. It's either one or the other. Now, you can be in gray areas there where you're expressing yourself, you're conforming in some areas, but not in other areas. But that very fact that you're free to make that choice guilt-free indicates a left-hand path inclination or motivation. All right, I hope I made that clear. All right, so why did they call him this? Now, this is where I want to come back and I want to get into subliminal messaging. I'm going to go a little bit longer today because I haven't even gotten into the Lucifer stuff. So it's going to be a longer live. Hope that's okay. Where subliminal messaging comes in, what is subliminal messaging? It's messaging that comes into our subjective universe, things that come into our awareness, things that come into our consciousness, things that influence things in our internal universe, influence how we feel, influence how we think, influence how we talk and how we behave, that we don't realize is coming in because it's coming in at a threshold that is below the level of awareness. Yeah, Renegade says, live and let live. Yeah, that's left-hand path philosophy. Religion does not say live and let live. That's right-hand path philosophy. And that's why I'm going to be really a stickler. I used to say, oh, yeah, you can blend them. But I'm going to be a stickler about it and say, no, you can't. Because it's just, otherwise there's no distinction. We have to understand there is this battle, there is this war, and we either succumb to the world around us and outside of us, or we fight the battle to express what is within us and our own divinity to the world around us and see that as our best gift and our best service that we can give to mankind. In other words, from a left-hand path perspective, I'm a unique individual. I'm a universe all unto myself. And my best service to humanity, my best gift that I can give is to live myself fearlessly, to live myself creatively. Courageously and creatively and powerfully. Because here's the thing. I want you to come back to, I'm going to get to Subliminal and Lucifer, I promise. But I want you to come back and think about what I said about the hive mind and the bees and the wolves. They existed the same, exactly the same social orders, exactly the same behaviors in any location in the world, in any time period in history, exactly the same, which means then there is no progress. There's no progress. There's no growth. because growth and progress requires a breaking away from the way things have always been done. Nothing progressive. If everything is just harmonious, in other words, this is why Christians will say God doesn't grow, because God can't change. And why eternity will be heaven. Right? C. Rodriguez says, I am already complete. Absolutely. 100%. Right-hand path would say, something outside of you has to make you complete. You're not complete within and of yourself. So from a left-hand path perspective, we say, who I am, me being my most authentic self, and expressing that, that's the best gift that I can give to humanity. That's the best service that I can do for them. And I can only best express that when I'm in my own bliss, when I'm in my own element, when I'm in my own happiness, when I'm in my own joy, when I'm in my own self-love and self-compassion. So the left-hand path is full of self-love, self-compassion. It truly is a recognition of self-centeredness. If I were to say it truly is self-centeredness, you'd hear that the wrong way, because just this idea, which brings us back to subliminal messaging, that self-centeredness is something that we need to give up, comes from a right-hand path perspective, from those that want to impose their will, their values, their culture, their ideas, and their visions upon you. Therefore, it's bad to be self-centered. But the truth is, wherever you go, there you are. You are the center. You are at the center and the heart of your own experience. You are at the center and the heart of your own universe. And to the best of my knowledge, in this life, it's very, very difficult to change that. The mystical path is a path that says, I don't want that. The mystical, the idea of getting off the wheel of reincarnation says, I don't want this individual expression. I don't want this growth. That's what's causing me suffering. So I want myself to blend in. That's where all these concepts that get so messed up with people that haven't done years of study with good teachers, or weren't born in what we call an Eastern culture. We can get it all messed up because we say there is no self, there is no soul, there is nothing that's in there. Well, that's a Hindu philosophy that is right-hand path. It's not a tantric Hindu philosophy. Remember, these things are not homogenous. Eastern philosophy is not one monolith. And the left-hand path comes from the Vedas. And so the Vedas would say you can either lose the self or you can further differentiate the self. In fact, what they believed, a lot of them, and I know I'm making it homogenous right now, but one of the teachings was that when you die, you can go the way of the devas, you can go the way of the gods, which is to go off into the sun, which I'm going to get to in just a second. Maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. Is this interesting? Is it like, if I'm boring you, I'm over my hour. If you go off into the light, the day, the devas, this is sort of the idea of heaven, and you get off the wheel of life, death, and rebirth. You get off the wheel of reincarnation because you have become one with everything. You've lost. And so the evil comes from karma. What keeps us coming back is karma. And karma does not mean, in its original concept of karma simply means action. Have you ever wondered why yogis in the East would do all kinds of weird stuff? Like, there was some yogi, you can look this up on YouTube, but he held his right arm up like this for like decades, and all the muscles atrophied and stuff, and it became frozen up here. Or why do they sit in positions for long hours? Or why do they teach that if you have sexual intercourse, that you are giving up your life force, and that the idea in some concepts is to bring that life force up into the third eye, or bring it up the spinal column, and to awaken Kundalini? All those concepts, because karma is about action. So it's coming into this world of action where there is this conflict between the microcosm and the macrocosm, between the subjective universe and the objective universe, that creates all the suffering. So when you die, you have the choice. I can go with the devas, I can go off into heaven, I can go off into the light, or essentially I can go off into the darkness. I'm gonna have to plug in my computer. I don't like to mess with it because it gets in my way, but my battery's dying. And I want to get to the Lucifer part because it's important. So I can go off into that, the way of the divas, or I can choose the way of the ancestors. I can choose the way of the ancestors. I can go down. These are based on shamanic cosmologies. I can go to the underworld, basically. And if I choose that, then I'm choosing to reincarnate and choosing a life with my ancestors. And from that perspective, then, because basically from the Hindu perspective, you're getting out of hell. So all these ideas of no self inside of you and Zen meditation and ego and all this stuff is rooted in a cosmology that says that we are already in hell and we keep reincarnating into hell, and we have to lose this stuff in this life in order to go into samsara, or to go to nirvana, or to go to whatever their version of heaven is, which is essentially nothingness. And so they say the self is an entire illusion. See, the self is an illusion. The ego is bad. From the left-hand path perspective, it's saying, no, I want this self. I want this sense of separation. I want to maintain it. And from this preservation of my own subjective universe, learn to relate and express this universe, which does not comply, by the way, with natural laws. I just saw Joe's comment. What do we do in a 24-hour day? I'm not sure where you're coming from with that question, Joe, but my thought is we sleep, right? And when we dream, that subjective universe is wide awake. I mean, it's the only reality that we're in. And it doesn't follow the laws of nature. It doesn't follow the laws of the objective universe. And so from the left-hand path perspective, there's so much more freedom. I can daydream that I can fly. I can daydream that I can relocate. In other words, my internal universe, this microcosm, is not subject in any way, shape, or form. Does it conform to the laws outside of me? So the right-hand path says the best way to go is forget all that stuff. Quit being daydreamy. Quit being fantastical. Quit being flighty. Quit being self-centered. The truth is we're all self-centered. It's what we do with that self-centeredness that determines whether or not we're selfish, which is a totally different thing altogether. All right. So just in response to what Joe's saying, right? Like that just helps us recognize this. And so from the left-hand path, it's like, man, I'm enthralled with this freedom and this potential. What is the potential possibilities for humanity? You'll see, I mean, you can make a really good argument that Jesus and the early Christians were starting a left-hand path religion. Even the Apostle Paul, to some degree, was starting a left-hand path religion because he was breaking with the norms of Judaism. Jesus was breaking with the norms of Judaism. If Jesus wasn't a true, what Stephen Flowers calls Lord of the left-hand path, then he would have never been crucified by religious and political institutions, because religious and political institutions want to absorb the self, right? They want as many votes as possible, or they want as many people going along with it as possible. They want to really devour you. It's a form of psychic cannibalism. I want to take your psychic energy, your belief, I want to eat it. This is where egregores come from. Okay. Back to subliminal messaging, because this is important. Back to how we got the term right and left-hand path. This is important. And then we'll do a little bit with Lucifer and I'll be done. So it was believed in the ancient world that there was a flow of cosmic life energy that kept us alive. And this flow of energy entered through the left hand and left through the right hand. So there's a flow entering through the left hand and exiting through the right hand. All right. Now, most of our compasses, most of what we think about in terms of how we orient a map, listen to the language, how we orient a map, is we do it from the north. We do it by the North Star or by the North Pole. So we have a tendency to think I'm facing north. My right hand is to the east. My left hand is to the west. My right hand is to the rising of the sun. My left hand is to the setting of the sun. But in ancient cultures, because they were so astrologically minded, because the sun was so important in the agricultural age, well, even in the hunting gathering time period, the sun was important because the sun was so essential to survival. People would orient not to the north, but to the east. At least if you were basically from the rising of the sun, they would orient to the rising of the sun. That's why we call it the Orient, because we're oriented east. So if you're oriented east, then the energy comes in from the left hand, leaves through the right hand. If you were to turn around and go into opposition to that, so that you were oriented now towards the west and you were oriented towards the setting of the sun, then you are going against nature. You are reversing the natural order of things, and it's coming in through your right hand and leaving through your left hand. Why are you even freaking talking about this, Aaron? Because it helps illustrate the difference between a left-hand path and a right-hand path, but it also, I want to get into the subliminal messaging and how it still affects us, how this stuff is still with us today and affects our subjective universe. So those that chose the left-hand path then, from its origins, would embrace a spiritual path that says, rather than conforming to the norms, I am going to deliberately and purposely not conform. So the sun rises in the east, it goes down in the west. So light, that which, watch this, it rises in the east. So all right-hand path religions, everything that's about conforming, everything that's about righteousness is associated with light and day. The west, where the sun goes down, so those that choose to be different, those that choose not to conform, those that choose to express themselves in ways that are contrary to the social norms, that are those that choose, let me say it this way to connect it with the stuff I've been saying, those that choose to live their own dream rather than subjecting their dream to the corporate dream of the world are facing the other direction. So therefore, it's black, it's dark, it's evil, it's destructive, it's death. So if you deconstruct from religion, you're evil. You're following the powers of darkness. The powers of darkness were that which created disorder within a system. They were Tiamat was the god of chaos in the ancient world. Again, all progress comes from chaos. All new creation comes from chaos. If there's not chaos, there can't be creativity because there's only conformity. There cannot be creativity where there is conformity. There cannot be progress or growth because it requires a change. It requires a disorientation. This is why a lot of us have been, in this sense, called into left-hand path spirituality, if I can use that term, and we went through deconstruction. Even if we ended up atheist, if we started out as Christians and we went through some kind of a deconstructive process where we said, hey, I have some individual ideas here. I'm hearing a different sound. I want to march to the beat of a different drum. Right? You guys are the agents of progress, but in the process, there is a real season of disorientation. See, when to turn to face east, and then to turn to the west, is to violate nature. To say I'm choosing the expression of my own subjective self. Thanks, Barbara. My own subjective self. So I'm turning to the west. Right? Because I'm not going to conform. I'm going to go a different way. is to be disoriented, because we orient towards the rising of the sun. We orient towards the east. That's why it's called the Orient from our perspective. This is where the subliminal messaging is really important. But I want you to understand that you can also you have to walk through and embrace a season of disorientation. The fact that you have experienced disorientation means that you shifted from a right-hand path perspective to a left-hand path perspective. Most of us did it without this knowledge, so most of us doesn't know what the heck's going on. What the hell's going on? One day I'm just doing fine. I'm got all my Christian friends. I'm going to church. I know who I am. I know where I'm going to go when I die. Everything's hunky-dory, except that the entire time I'm wrestling with myself. I'm wrestling with my flesh. I'm trying to submit myself to the will of God. I'm trying to find the will of God outside myself. What is his am I in his perfect will, or am I just in his acceptable will? And we have all this turmoil and everything that's going on. That's that chaos. That's that disruption that brings forth progression, that brings forth growth. Because if the natural order of things, or the natural societal order, or the natural thought of things never disrupts, then we're just like the wolves and the bees. That's why they call it a hive mind. That's why they call it a hive mind. You see? But in order to, because of this path, it's incredibly disorienting. And so at some point you chose yourself. You chose your own conscience. You chose your own heart. You chose your own ideas. You chose your own welfare and well-being over that of someone else. How many of us that were in the church, especially those of us that were in ministry, sacrificed ourselves, sacrificed our own well-being, sacrificed what we wanted to do on a Sunday afternoon or whatever, because we had to serve. We had to be there as the pastor. We had whatever. We had to be there as the deliverance minister. We had to be there as the good, faithful church member that's painting the damn church, or cleaning the carpets, or like, God dang, I got to go to another conference because there's a guest speaker and they got to make sure that somebody shows up. And so I'm spending all that time and energy, and all the while I'm embracing this, and I'm in turmoil, and I'm in frustration, and I'm trying to kill off my sexual desires, or my self-centered desires, trying to put others ahead of me, love others, try to live some sacrificial life, because the sacrifice of Christ is the demonstration of the love of God. And if I'm going to be loving, I have to sacrifice myself, all that stuff, right? But at some point you said no to that stuff. At some point you said, no, this is crazy. And at some point you turned your attention away from the macrocosmos. You turned your attention away from what you were being told to do. And you dared to take a path of disobedience. And that brings about progress. That brings about change. So therefore, all of us that say, hey, whether we go all the way and say religion is bullshit, or we do like Dr. K. Fairchild and say, no, we've misunderstood these texts. And she's absolutely right. Absolutely right. Let's see what these are actually saying. And within the context of the scriptures, empowering people to understand that Christ is in them. And to change hemispheres, to move from the left brain to the right brain. See, but we have to go through disorientation. We have to. It's part of the process. So I applaud all of you that have deconstructed and embraced the disorientation. And it's lonely. It has to be lonely. Because if it's not lonely, it's not really progressive. Forget political distinctions between conservative and progressive. Forget about that. That's just groups trying to control your mind. If you are conservative, you are trying to conserve the way things are. You're trying to conserve the way things have already been done. If you are progressive, you're saying we need to move on from this. We need to progress. There's been progression in physics. There's been progression in biology and medicine. There's been progression in cosmology and astrophysics. There's been progression in travel. There's been progression in communication. There has been no progress in religion, because religion is right-hand path and it doesn't want progress. That's why we're always trying to figure out what's the true what was the true church? What did the true church believe? What were the true teachings of Jesus? I mean, some guy that I respect and love, huge YouTube following, and is spending all this time talking about Pauline Christianity versus Jesus Christianity. And we need to get back to the red letter Christianity. We need to get back to the Jesus Christianity. But this person also teaches, every time he teaches, is essentially teaching a form of right-hand path spirituality. And there's nothing wrong with right-hand path spirituality. It's perfectly valid, but it is going to take you back rather than move you forward. It may look like it's moving you forward from a certain perspective, but we're going back to the future in the sense, if we're trying to find the original teachings of somebody that lived 2,000 years ago, and we're completely unaware that we don't have copies of that because he didn't write anything. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the earliest texts that we have are like 2nd century texts. So we have no idea what he said to begin with. And the most original source that we have is actually Pauline. But we want to make this whole thing, right? It's conserving rather than progressing. So all of you that deconstructed in your world, your corner of the world, your part of the world, all of you that embrace the loneliness that went with it, all of you that embrace the misunderstanding that goes with it, all of you that embrace the nonsensical comments that come at you on Facebook, or people that avoid you in the grocery stores and stuff like that, just understand that you're being progressive, that it's part of the left-hand path, and it is a spiritual path. Even if you don't end up with belief in God, even if you don't end up with spiritual, what I would call spiritual experiences, or honoring or recognizing that, to me, it's still a spiritual path, which is why I started out the talk talking about the difference, or just saying it can be philosophical or it can be spiritual. All right, let me come to Lucifer then. So Lucifer is a powerful archetype for us. No. Subliminal messaging. I mean, I'll get to the Lucifer stuff. I may have to do the Lucifer stuff later. Subliminal messaging. I want you to see this. So subliminal messaging means stuff that's coming in, that's shaping, impacting, influencing the subjective universe, that's coming into you from the objective universe, but it's coming outside of your conscious sensory awareness. So the classic tale of subliminal messaging was that in movies, and I believe this is illegal now, but when you'd go to the movie theater, they'd want you to buy popcorn and Coke or whatever. So you'd be watching the movie and they would slip in pictures of popcorn in the middle of the movie, or they would slip in pictures of Coke, but it would flash through the projector so quickly that your conscious mind would not pick up on it. But evidently, your subconscious mind, or your subliminal mind, the mind that is always operating below the level of consciousness, below the level of sensory awareness, picks that up, because just scientifically, right, sales of popcorn would increase after you saw that. Because remember, lots of movies, they would have intermissions for that kind of stuff. And those intermissions were designed not only to make a longer movie more tolerable, but also to help you, get up, or you'd have those little flicks, those short little B-movie flicks back at the time where maybe they'd show an episode of Zorro for 30 minutes or something, and they'd flash towards the end, popcorn pop. You wouldn't see it. It would come in, and their sales would increase versus film that didn't have that. So we know that subliminal messaging is a thing. All stage magic is based on subliminal messaging and subliminal manipulation. It's to influence your subjective universe in order to believe you're seeing something that you're not seeing. It's to manipulate the projection of the subjective universe onto the objective universe while there's intercourse between the two. So subliminal messaging is a message or a suggestion or an idea that comes in that we don't catch it as it's coming in. We don't see it. We don't recognize it, or what it's doing in our subjective universe, or what it's doing to us in our consciousness, or how it's influencing our thought and our behaviors. And it's very powerful because it can get us to believe in illusions. So here's why it's so difficult when I start talking about left-hand path, right-hand path for some people to get it. Because we are subliminally messaged from the time we are very little to believe that right hand way of living is the right way to go, and left hand way of living is the wrong way to go. So what do you mean by that, Aaron? This was such a concept in the origin of languages, this idea of, are you on the right-hand path or the left-hand path? Again, we don't talk about it today, but it was a big deal in these philosophies and in the ancient world. So being right-handed, notice it's not called the right foot path. Think about this for a minute. If you're talking about a path, you're probably not walking on your hands. So it would make more sense, both physically and metaphorically, to call it the right foot path or the left foot path. So why'd they pick the hand? Because the vast majority of people, I don't know the reason for this, but the majority of people write or perform better with their right hand than with their left hand. I happen to be left-handed, ironically. But the vast majority, the norm is to be right-handed. The abnorm is to be left-handed. Now, watch this. In our language, the word dexterity, if you say someone has good dexterity, it means skillfulness, typically with the hands, but it doesn't have to be used in that context. But we typically use it with the hands. If you have a lot of dexterity, I can do intricate things with my hands. I can do great things with my hands. That's right. I'm sorry. So the root word for dexterity, dextra, I think it is. You can check me on that. And I think it's either the Greek or the Latin, is for right hand. So the idea that you're skillful means that you're right-handed. The word left in the Latin, I think, or again, maybe it's the Greek. You can check me out. Just do an etymology search on these. The word for left is sinister. Or the word for the left hand is sinister. And it comes from these ideas of right-handed and left-handed path. Why do you think we say right to refer to a side and orientation, and right to say that you are correct? Why is it the same word? Because we started using right to mean that you were correct out of this concept of you're right-handed, meaning you're going with the flow, you're conforming, you're being a good little soldier. Now, the subconscious mind doesn't necessarily, because remember, dreams, for example, don't follow the natural order of things. They defy gravity, they defy common sense, just all kinds of stuff, right? So to be right is to be conformed to that standard. It's to change to fit, it's to change the subjective universe in order to fit the objective universe. Therefore, you are right. But if you are left, Renegade said, yes, they used to say left-handed people are demonic. Yeah. Well, shoot, even in my parents' generation, they still taught you to write with your left hand if you were left-handed, and they would slap your hand. If you tried to use the left hand, they would slap it and down. Or in a lot of Catholic schools, parochial schools, the nuns would, tie the hand behind the back or whatever to make sure they were writing right. Why? Because we're being programmed to forsake our subjectivity. So we can see it right there. Just basically, you have to write with your right hand. If you write with your left hand, it's a demon. Why? Why would they say that? It's not just because to be left-handed is to stand out, but it's because it became associated with this flow of energy and whether or not you were correctly oriented. So to be left-handed is to be sinister. To be right-handed is to be correct. So I don't know about you guys, but so much of my internal wrestling in this whole process has been, am I right? Am I right? I want to make sure I'm right. When I share something, I want to make sure I'm right. When I tell somebody something, I want to make sure I'm right. When I'm living, I want to make sure I'm right. Is theism right or atheism right? Is science right or is philosophy right? Is this right or that right? Constant obsession, which means that I hadn't fully embraced the left hand. Because the left hand, it changes the paradigm from right to wrong to say, is this going to make me change my internal universe to conform to the objective? Or is this going to grow and encourage and strengthen my individual expression, whatever that may be? Now, remember, the macrocosm, the external universe, is not going to accommodate your self-expression. And this is where one of the pitfalls happen. A lot of people will start on the left-hand path and they'll move to a right-hand path because, and all they've done is change friends. All they've done is changed associations. I used to associate with a group of people that were not Christian. Then when I got radically saved, all my relationships and friendships were in the church. We were right, everybody else was wrong. Lots of people can deconstruct, and they're going through that disorientation, but it can be really hard to continually push for and maintain that expression of self, or in the case of many of us watching and myself, that expression of the Christ self, or that expression of the divine self, right? Pushing for that. And this is where Lucifer comes in. Just real quick, I'm going to not spend a lot of time. I'll do a follow-up video for the group. So if you haven't joined the group, if you've listened this far, you might want to join the group. It's a Facebook group called New Day Global. I think it's in my bio on YouTube. If you're watching by YouTube, have to answer the questions, agree to the rules and all that kind of stuff. But I share actually less than lots of people, and there's lots of great stuff, content that gets posted on that page. A lot of awesome members in there. Let's see. Tommy says, I also heard that left-handed people were less trusted because the older way of shaking hands involved grasping arms, always the right, because it's making sure the other person wasn't hiding a weapon on their right arm. Yeah, I've heard that too. If someone was left-handed, they weren't trusted because they could be hiding a weapon on their left arm. Yeah, that's interesting. Again, this language is rooted, I don't know, Tommy, if you saw the beginning, it's rooted in Indo-European languages. And this idea of whether you were on the left-hand or the right-hand path was pretty prominent. Two totally different systems developed out of that, but that's the origins of it. That's the etymologies of it, is whether or not you're facing the sun rising or you're facing the sun setting. You can also look at it this way. Right-hand path religions are tied to, in some way, shape, or form, solar religions, worship of the sun, and the idea of getting to heaven, the idea of ascending. In order to ascend, you had to go, oh yeah, Tommy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. He says he's going to have to go back and rewatch. I'd love for you to watch it and just message me some feedback. That'd be awesome. You don't have to. I'm not putting pressure on you to watch. I'm fine. If you do, I'd love to get some feedback. Damn your Bengals, by the way. You'd have to go through the sun in order to get to heaven. Well, when you go through the sun, you're disintegrated. So again, all this talk about ego, giving up the ego, oneness, being at war with yourself, being at war with your ego, all this stuff are characteristics of right-hand path orientation. Now, without going into all the Lucifer stuff, let me just say this. Lucifer is believed by Christians to be the devil. Lucifer is believed to be the one who led the rebellion of 1/3 of the angels against God. And we have this whole mythology that we've developed that either sometime during or after the creation of the earth or before the creation or recreation of the earth, in the case of those that embrace a gap theory of scripture and creation, there was some kind of Luciferic rebellion. And the idea is that Lucifer was this really high-ranking archangel in heaven who tried to rebel against God and set up his own government, set up his own authority. Is this sounding familiar? Impose his own will. In fact, we often talked about the 5 I wills of Lucifer in scripture, which come out of Isaiah 14, which I won't take the time to go into, but I will do, I promise. I will do a follow-up video on this and just talk about the Luciferian archetype for those that are in the private group. I will ascend into heaven, right? I will sit on the farthest side of the north. I will exalt myself above the stars of God. I will basically be like the Most High. So it's the assertion of his own will. And so basically, Lucifer in the mythology is saying, I won't submit, I won't conform. I'm just as good as anybody else around here. And I'm going to impose my light, myself, upon the collective. And he was able to talk 1/3 of the angels into going with him. And they got thrown out of heaven by God. There was a war. Michael and the archangels fought. And they get thrown out of heaven. And they end up deceiving everybody on the earth. And that's how you can identify this and the serpent, the connection with the serpent. He became the serpent. Lucifer became the serpent in the garden. And the serpent told Adam and Eve, watch this. Think about how these are all ancient stories, but they're coming out of this concept of right-hand and left-hand path. Because as long as they're in the garden, they're in the right-hand path. They're in complete harmony with nature, and they're in complete harmony with God because they haven't disobeyed his only one commandment. So therefore, everything's growing nice for them. They're tilling the garden. And best of all, they're naked and not ashamed, right? They're just naked and not ashamed. And it's paradise. It's Eden, right? And if only Adam and Eve hadn't eaten at that damn tree, things would just have progressed. Death never would have come into existence and all this other stuff. But here comes this evil, rebellious angel called Lucifer. He embodies the serpent, I guess. And he talks Eve into eating at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil. I want you to notice there were 2 trees. But I want you to also notice this. There's only one descriptor to the good tree. The tree we want. The tree that's desirable. The tree of life. It's not life and death. There's no polarity. It's oneness. The tree of life. The one. Life. And then the second tree has duality in it. The tree of the knowledge. It's not just the tree of knowledge. Tommy says, wait, if the right-hand path involves more nudity, I have to reconsider. Actually, it's reversed now because Adam and Eve screwed it up. So now it's actually the left-hand path, and this is true in some practitioners because left-hand path talks a lot about sex magic and various different things. So you might want to think more about left-hand path. Anyway, I'm getting embarrassed just even talking about it, but I'll get healed from that at some point eventually. So they're naked and not ashamed, and there's oneness there. There's harmony at the tree of life, but at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, there's duality. There's good and evil, or there's polarity. There's two ends of a spectrum. So Lucifer embodies the serpent, and in the same way, that Lucifer rebelled, said, I'm going to take my subjective universe and express it. I'm going to take my light and express it. The same way that he rebelled against God, he gets humanity to rebel against God. And the moment they do that, they basically turn around, if you will, from this ancient perspective of being oriented towards the rising of the sun or the setting of the sun. And so what happens in the story, what happens to the couple when they do that? Immediately, watch this, immediately they become aware of their own subjective universe. They become aware of their own subjective self, because the moment that they ate at the tree, they became like God. Watch this. They became like God, knowing good and evil, or knowing this duality of themselves within the separate subjective universe and the objective universe outside of them. In other words, I know myself, Adam, as separate from Eve, and Eve, I know myself as Eve, as separate from Adam. And oh my God. And so we make fig leaves. I hear the voice of the Lord walking in the garden. So I know myself. I know myself as a separate entity now. I have become like God. And now there's disharmony. Now there's disunion. Now there's conflict. Now remember, we might think that we want to live in this kind of communal paradise where everybody just gets along and everybody just agrees and everybody goes along to get along. But then we're like the bees. Then we're like the wolves. And there's no progress. What sets us apart is that we have this awareness of this conflict between the subjective universe and the objective universe. And that's what was introduced into Adam and Eve. Now, the whole story of Lucifer, I'm going to say, rebelling and taking a third of the angels is probably all bullshit. And you don't have to subscribe full on to materialism or scientific materialism or atheism or even just rejection of Christianity or Christ to say it's bullshit. Because we pull it from texts, this idea, if I were teaching Christians about evil and about Lucifer and about the fall and about rebellion, the entire Christian story is based on two isolated passages, one in Isaiah 14 and one in Ezekiel 28. I'll get into this later in the week in my next episode. But they're really prophecies that were given to earthly kings. So some early Christians came along and said, yes, these are prophecies given to early kings, but they also tell about this rebellion that happened. And when they say a third of the angels, they're taking some obscure verse from the book of Revelation, chapter 12, and where the dragon, there's a war in heaven, and the dragon, who is the serpent, who then is Lucifer, and they tie all this stuff together in a really cut and paste, cherry picking kind of manner, and then come up with this entire mythology. It's not really in there. You will find no verse whatsoever that talks about an angelic rebellion, number one, unless you use the Revelation 12 scripture, I suppose. It says there's a war in heaven. It doesn't really say, if I'm correct in remembering, it doesn't really say what causes it. And it says a third of the stars. The dragon used his tail and took a third of the stars. But there's no direct passage that says that Lucifer existed, that Lucifer was an archangel, that Lucifer thought his light would shine against God, that Lucifer got kicked out of heaven, and definitely nothing in there to say that he embodied the snake. The truth of the matter is that the word Lucifer in the Latin refers to the planet Venus, phosphorus in the Greek, the morning star as it gets translated into English, and it's talking about the planet Venus, which shows up sometimes at night as the sun is setting, although the ancients thought that was a different planet. So for them, Venus in the morning, when the sun is rising, is the morning star, the light of the morning star, which came to represent the light of knowledge. So I want you to watch who becomes the bad guy in the way the stories are told in Genesis. or the way the story is told in the fall, the serpent is the bad guy. Now watch this. Once they become aware of their subjective universe, now they're out of harmony. They're disharmonious, not with God. There's nothing in the text that says that they are not in harmony with God. It just says that they hid themselves from God. And God lures them out. Adam, where art thou? And brings them out. Where there is the lack of harmony now is between them and the objective universe. In other words, the ground is not going to produce for you anymore. It's going to be thorns and thistles, and through the sweat of your brow will you eat. Conflict and disharmony. For the woman, through pain, you're going to give birth to children, and then disharmony between the sexes, right? Your desire shall be towards your husband, and he shall rule over you. But nothing about disharmony with God. In fact, they still worship God. If they didn't still worship God and have relationship and have fellowship with God, if sin breaks fellowship with God, then explain Cain and Abel. I'll just leave that one alone. The other thing is that we say that they lied. We say that the serpent lied to Adam and Eve when God himself confirms that Adam and Eve, that the serpent had told the truth. Read the actual text. Read the freaking text. The serpent says, if the serpent lied, he lied in that he said, you will not die. But they didn't die. So we come in and say, oh, but they died spiritually. Really? Well, what's spiritual death? Separation from God. Again, explain the offerings of Cain and Abel. So God himself says, they've become like one of us. They've become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Therefore, we need to bar the tree of life from them. This is a whole teaching in and of itself that I could get into. So we automatically, from a Christian perspective, say that the serpent is the bad guy. But we do this from an orthodoxy, a right-thinking way. The Gnostic Christians actually see the serpent as the hero in the story. The serpent who points them towards knowledge as the hero in the story. Lucifer, therefore, and I'll develop this more in a longer thing. Lucifer, therefore, can be an archetype, a very powerful being. Now, when I say being, I've already said, I don't believe the angel story, the rebellion story, or that this guy's name was Lucifer. They took it from watching the movement of the stars, Venus shining, competing with the sun, and then through the rotation of the earth, falling away. They're just watching what's happening in the sky, and a prophet says, you see that, King of Tyre, that's how you're going to be. And then Christians took it and made this whole mythology out of it. However, because I give more reality than most people to the subjective universe, to ideas that are real things, and even this idea of egregores and stuff, then for me, Lucifer is an archetype or a being or a current of power within consciousness that empowers us to shake off the bonds of the right-hand path, or to shake off the bonds of conformity, or it is that principle, that being, that power, however you want to look at it, that empowers us with contradiction, that empowers us with self-expression, that empowers us, that says, let your light shine before men. Which is why, if you look at the ministry of Jesus, it's very Luciferic, because he's in contradiction with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the high priest and all of that. And that's why they kill him, right? And so the last reference that Jesus of Christ that we have in the Bible, the way it's put together, is in the book of Revelation. And he says, I am the bright and morning star. He literally says, I am phosphorus. He literally says in the Latin, I am Lucifer. And from the Gnostic perspective, they would say, yes, Christ is Lucifer, and Christ is the serpent in the garden. And they would see not a fall, yes, something that generates suffering. Now watch this from an ancient perspective. Get your Western evangelical mind out of there for a minute. Look at this in light of some of these Eastern concepts. Even the concept of reincarnation, because remember, that concept of reincarnation was prevalent. Plato taught reincarnation. Some of the early church fathers, like Origen, taught some forms of reincarnation. Jesus himself speaks about reincarnation. This is just ubiquitous in the ancient world, these ideas. So that lest he take of the tree of life and live forever is not talking about, it's talking about physical death. Yes, it's not talking about the loss of the soul. It's actually introducing this concept of karma and reincarnation. Now, some people say that's a stretch, Aaron, and I'm sure some Bible scholar somewhere can totally refute that. But in my mind, this certainly can happen, right? Gnostics certainly, some sects of Gnostics certainly believed in reincarnation. So the serpent, watch this, is pointing them towards knowledge. So rather than being a fall, what the serpent does, even in the text itself, is he activates. So humanity was made in the image of God, in the likeness of God, and the serpent comes along and says, if you eat at that tree, if you eat at the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will become like God. So activates that divine principle within us, watch this, through knowledge, through gnosis. And then it's that activation of that awareness of our own divinity, that awareness of our own subjective universe that then struggles against a universe that's conspiring to kill it or subjugate it or conform it into its own image. So from the Gnostic perspective, the serpent becomes the hero in the story, and Jesus or Christ or the Christ principle is connected to the Luciferian archetype. Let me see just real quick some of the comments. Barbara says, I feel that Lucifer is a principle of contraction that stands in opposition to the principle that is expansion. Like lungs, both are necessary for life. Both principles master their roles in the creation of the material universe. Absolutely. I would agree with that. And actually, this is a perfect segue into the next thing that I want to go into, because Barbara's pointing out this idea of polarity. At the tree of life, remember I said there's oneness. At the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, there's duality or polarity. Or there's expansion on one end and contraction. It's not to say that expansion's good and contraction's evil, or contraction's good and expansion's evil. As Barbara points out, they work together as part of creation. But now watch this. Why is it? Okay, so I'm just going to geek out for Bible nerds. Did you know there are two within Second Temple Judaism and within the streams of thought that was Jewish also was not monolithic? Was also not homogenous. And there were two stories of the fall, and they were competing stories. And the Adam and Eve story is just the one that happened to make it into our Bibles, probably because of the influence of Christianity and the Orthodox Church. Not everyone believed those writings or that story of Adam and Eve, even in the first century, or what we call Second Temple Judaism. Because there was the Enochian teachings and the Enochian literature, and the Book of Enoch, for better or for worse, didn't make it into the Jewish canon of Scripture and didn't make it into our Christian Bibles, even though it's referenced by New Testament writers. In the Book of Enoch, there's not two naked vegans in a garden talking to a snake. In the Book of Enoch, humanity is created as a species like any other species. So there's humanity, not just two people. But the angels start to lust after the women, and they come down and they fornicate and they marry the daughters of man. That gets the angels in trouble. Didn't get humanity in trouble. That got the angels in trouble. The book of Jude, the book of 2 Peter refer to this as the angels that left their first estate. What got humanity in trouble was that the angels came down and taught them knowledge. They taught them about metalworking. They taught them about makeup and adorning. They taught them about warfare. They taught them about all kinds of different things. And it was because the angels gave humanity knowledge that the problem started. So you have to ask yourself, why is it that knowledge is demonized by Christians? It's not necessarily demonized in the scriptures. The serpent isn't necessarily the bad guy in the story. In fact, if the Torah did anything, it gave people the knowledge of good and evil. It gave people in Israel the knowledge of good and evil. That's what the Torah or the law was. That's what it was for. Even the Apostle Paul says that that's what it was for. And then he goes on and says the law is not evil, the law is good, but I have to conform. We're back to the Romans 7 crap, which is all part of this. I should expand this teaching because obviously I'm going for 2 hours on it, which I've never done on here before. So obviously, something I'm very passionate about and interested in. But why is it that if you eat at the tree of knowledge, that's bad? Like I'm stepping out of my teaching for a minute. I'm just asking the question. It's a good deconstruction question to ask your friends. Why is it that knowledge is always condemned? Why is it in the book of Enoch that humanity gets in trouble because they're given knowledge from the angels? They taught them knowledge of magic as well. Why is that a bad thing? Or why, let's look at the Tower of Babel. Why is unity a bad thing? Oh my gosh, everybody's together. You realize when it says that they were it's the Tower of Babel, when it says they were all of one mind, think about what that means. That means there was no racism. That means there was no misogyny. That means there was no, and you could say, yeah, Aaron, that was hive mind. And so it's seen by God as a bad thing. But I want you to think about this, the way religion twists this, because you can look at it through two different lenses. The way religion twists this, the serpent is the bad guy, Lucifer's bad, and the angels, the fallen angels that had sex with the women, they're bad, and unity and harmony among humanity is also bad. And so we have to go screw that up. We have to go mess with that. We have to mix up their languages and make sure that they're divided, make sure they're fighting with each other. Think about that. Now, however, if we look at the growth and evolution of the soul, we talk about I'm growing as a person, talk about I'm evolving in my ideas. If we look at that through this frame of the objective universe and the subjective universe, if we look at that through this frame of the left-hand path and the right-hand path, then this particular knowledge that makes us godlike is a knowledge of the inward universe that causes it to expand. And the word good and evil is translated or understood from a very Western mindset from centuries of legal culture, laws and governments, and all kinds of stuff. You could look at it from the principle of just duality in general, and those things that we tend to label as good and evil, or pleasant and unpleasant experiences, or just think about it in terms of polarity versus oneness. So in other words, in order for you to grow in your individual godhood, you have to feed upon knowledge, and that particular knowledge has to have the principle of dualism in it. This is totally different than the philosophy of dualism or duality that I talked about in an earlier video. I'm just talking about comparison. Pain and pleasure, they both exist on the same continuum in that they are both physical sensations that we feel, but one we find pleasing and desirable, and the other one we find displeasing and undesirable, right? But we have to, so the duality, the polarity is there for the expansion of this subjective universe. If reincarnation is a thing, and I believe it is, but this is where I'm getting into my subjective universe, not trying to impose it on yours. I just think the best evidence that I've seen leads me to believe that it probably is. And it was ancient. So you can look at this two ways. You can apply this contemporaneously if you believe in that stuff, or you can just say this is kind of built into the story and the way things were in the ancient cultures when this story was written. And understand that rather than this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth being hell and being punishment and being something that we choose to escape from the left-hand path, it would be something that we choose to embrace, because it is only in the world of this polarities where we understand, where we can see and perceive the distinction between self and non-self. That's another way to say it. It's probably an easier way to say it. God dang, it only took me 2 hours to find an easier way to say it. The distinction between self and what is non-self, what is me and what is not me. Brilliant. They say a good teacher can make the complex simple. I have a tendency to take the simple and make it complex. I could have just said that from the beginning. Me, not me. Self, non-self. It's only in this realm, this environment, that distinction occurs. From everything I've read, from near-death experiencers, the ones that at least didn't have religious experiences, there's this realm of non-duality that they enter into, of just sort of where time and space, the concept of time and space disappears. The division, you communicate telepathically, all this stuff. So that line, that delineation, polarity is necessary for the delineation between the self and the non-self, between what's me and what's not me. And so it's only in these bodies and in this physical world that I can expand and grow the me, because it's only then that I can really get to know the me and experience the me. Requires duality. It requires duality. So I can only grow and expand in this physical body, which would explain why most of us cannot remember anything about our past lives, because we probably spent that life trying to survive or conforming according to some form of the right-hand path. And so therefore, the individualness that we experience as we come into this life is not something that is preserved or brought with us. I think probably as we expand the boundaries, or strengthen rather, let me say this differently, expand the soul, expand the self, and strengthen those boundaries, which is what the left-hand path is all about, that we can probably then in future lives, if they are future, and our future lives, retain those ideas. So again, when Adam and Eve die physically, the idea is they're coming back. This is in the Bible. Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? Some say that you are Elijah, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. Maybe even John the Baptist come back from the dead. Who do you say that I am? You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. So not being able to eat at the tree of life means you're just at the beginning of the development of your divine selfhood. And the only way to expand the growth of that divine selfhood is through cycles of birth, death, and resurrection, because the ancient idea was when you died, you could choose samsara. If you got to a certain level with your karma, you could choose to get off and out of the cycle of being born into this duality, or you could choose the way of your ancestors and continue to grow and expand. One was considered the right-hand path, going to heaven. The other was considered the left-hand path. All right, let me sum all of this up. So from a left-hand path perspective, the ego is not bad. The ego is not evil. The ego is the entire point. From the left-hand path perspective, you having individual ideas that differ from mine is encouraged. From the left-hand path perspective, your individual freedom is encouraged. Yes, the left-hand path is lonely. Yes, the left-hand path is disorienting. Yes, the left-hand path is lesser known. It is also the pathway to progress. It's the pathway into our future. Some of us are forerunners of that. Some of us are early adopters, if you prefer that language for it. The right-hand path, ego is bad because ego is what gives me a sense of separation. Left-hand path, ego is good because ego gives me a sense of separation. Right-hand path, I'll get into this too, because in the law of one, they talk about service to self versus service to others. That's a false delineation, I think. And I'll talk about that in another teaching. Right-hand path, pour yourself out for your community. Your individualism doesn't matter. Left-hand path, your right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness should be preserved at all costs. Left-hand path, self-actualization. Right-hand path, self-sacrifice. Left-hand path, I'm increasing and growing in my potentials, including my divine potentials and my spiritual potentials as a human being. Right-hand path, John the Baptist, he must increase, I must decrease. So to sum it all up, there you go. So is the practice that you're doing spiritually, the teachings that you're listening to, are they expanding the self, growing the self, teaching you how to live effectively as yourself and encouraging your individual freedom? Or are they restricting the self, impeding the self? Are they making you feel bad and ashamed? Are they making you feel like you have to sacrifice portions or parts of yourself in order to get to God or to be spiritual or to fit in with the community? Just come along and get along and be part of the hive mind. Right-hand path. Which teachings are you listening to? This idea of no self, I'm going to have to come back and talk about that. This idea of no self is frustrating for me, but that's because I'm committed to left-hand path. I'm committed to authentic expression. And I love diversity, the diversity of ideas. And the more I relax into, here's the interesting thing. The more I relax into myself, the more I have pursued this path of self-compassion and self-love, the more I have explored my own consciousness through meditation and astral projection and other different, what Ray Hernandez calls contact modalities. The more that I've learned, the more comfortable I settle into those things, the less threatened I am by the world outside of me, the less I have to defend those borders, the more able I am to open my heart and mind to fellowship and communion and conversation with people who think differently than me. So far, for me, it's been a good path, and the fruit of it's been really good. All right, let's see. Lots of comments. My goodness. And Tommy says, I've heard it said that seeking to overcome or destroy the ego in itself is an egotistical endeavor. Well, because you have to wonder who's the self that's doing the destroying. Who's the self that's getting rid of the self? Still come back to self. First Heaven Force says Lucifer will drag you to hell with him. Okay. Taffy Addison says, I don't know if you know Bashar, but said we know before we were born, we were given a free will. My problem with that, how can that be free will if we don't remember Isn't that a form of control? Yes, I'm not sure about Bashar, what Bashar says, but just philosophically, logically, reasonably thinking this out, yes, that makes perfect sense. Let me just say this. I've kind of moved away as I've grown in this freedom. And that's really what it is, a growth of freedom and a growth in self-trust. I become less concerned about the source of information and more concerned about the content of the information. And I don't feel obliged to appeal to authority and agree with something or believe something because it comes from a certain source. I want to look at the content of it. I want to apply my own reason. Watch this. I want to apply my own subjective universe as part of left-hand path living, my own critical thinking to that information, then decide if I want to believe it, irregardless. It's not a word. Regardless of where it came from. Yeah, Taffy says, is there consequences for our actions? And then Joyce responds, Taffy, that is karma. Yeah, the consequences of our actions. Again, the word karma means action. But also, again, we are so brainwashed into right and wrong ways of thinking that that becomes an urgent question to us. Or not an urgent, but a pressing question that often comes up. But it's because our paradigm is limited. I want to read this. Destiny Edwards says, I bless and worship the name of God on how I got cured from hepatitis B virus. I was diagnosed with hepatitis B virus, and I've tried all I can to get cured, but all to no avail until I saw a post in a health forum about a herbalist man who prepare herbal medications. I don't know if you're trying. That's really long. No disrespect to your testimony at all. I'll have to go back and read that. But it looks like, looks like you're promoting somebody. And I get that you're excited about it and whatever, but also we have no way of verifying that, whether that's accurate. So I'm going to have to remove that. I'm sorry, just because you're promoting someone else. That I don't want people thinking I'm endorsing that. And just as far as like social media etiquette, Destiny, I get that you're sharing your testimony, but that's just not good etiquette. I'd recommend you don't do that because there's good reason for that, because you can be using someone else's platform. Mine's really small, but you can be using someone else's platform to look like they're endorsing something that they're not endorsing, which would violate their free will and be unethical. All right. Lots of comments. I'll go back through these. Thanks everybody for watching. Really appreciate it. I've been over 2 hours. I can't believe it. I hadn't intended on doing that. I will do, I promise, a follow-up video sometime this week. I don't know when, with the next holiday coming up. But at some point next week, I'll do a video for the group strictly around the Lucifer issue. If you're still on, thank you for watching. I'm losing my voice. I've talked so long and so passionately. Hope you had a Merry Christmas. Hope you have a wonderful, Happy New Year. Again, I consider time to be your most precious commodity. Some of you, if you can give financially to help us, that'd be great. In the description, there's a link to our PayPal page, but you've already given your most precious commodity to me, in my mind, which is your time that you've spent with me. And I deeply appreciate it. And so with that, I say namaste.